CodeIgniter is a PHP development framework. The purpose of using a framework for development is twofold. It not only establishes a structure for your code, it also offers pre-written functionality that will help simplify the development of the most common aspects of a website. CodeIgniter is an MVC framework, meaning that your site will primarily operate using three classes: the model, the view, and the controller, hence MVC. The model provides access and interactions with your data sources, whether it be your database or files or web services, anything that you would write to or retrieve data from. The view contains all of your HTML and display logic. Looping through blog entries as an associative array to format them in HTML would be an example of display logic. Finally, the controller interacts directly with your models and views and controls the flow of your application. This screencast focuses on briefly explaining the structure of CodeIgniter itself and familiarizing you with some of the terminology used. I set up a project in Zen Studio, and I'm just going to go ahead and explain the structure of the framework. In the root directory of your CodeIgniter installation, you'll see a system, a user guide, and index.php. The system contains all of the CodeIgniter code except for the index.php. The index.php simply instantiates the CodeIgniter object and executes the code within. The user guide naturally is just a copy of the most recent version of the user guide, which is actually very well written and extremely useful. Inside the system folder, you'll see we have your application folder into which all of your application exists. The cache folder is for CodeIgniter's internal caching system. If the result of a query has not changed, it will go ahead and spit back the HTML from a flat file, and you can set it to expire at an arbitrary time. CodeIgniter contains the actual CodeIgniter base classes. It actually will run on PHP 4 or 5, therefore it needs different base classes to implement the same functionality, where 4 doesn't have what it needs. The database class is actually a little bit different than many of the other classes in CodeIgniter, simply because it has the full active record functionality, and it offers a lot that the other classes just don't. The fonts folder is where you would install naturally your fonts. A helper in CodeIgniter is it's a PHP file that does not require the existence of CodeIgniter. It simply contains a collection of functions that serve a similar purpose. You might have a helper that helps you interact with spreadsheets or formatting files to your liking, or there's just unlimited uses for helpers. The language folder allows you to change the translation for many built-in bits of functionality, such as form validation, your default form validation messages, etc. You can actually add multiple languages in here, replace the files, and CodeIgniter itself can easily be translated. The libraries folder under the system folder contains the core libraries, or the library set that ships with CodeIgniter. There's quite a bit of functionality contained in here, and this is one of the major benefits from using CodeIgniter. You have a benchmarking class that can help you profile your application. It easily will tell you how long your different queries take to run, and you can set start and stop points. So if you have a chunk of code and you'd like to know how long it takes to execute that code under various circumstances, you can set a start point before it and an end point after it, and the profiler will actually tell you how long it takes to run. It has a built-in calendar function that actually creates your calendar config. The configuration system for CodeIgniter is pretty nice. It just allows you to create a configuration array and then pull it back from any of your other code. The controller class is actually one of the core aspects of CodeIgniter. That's going to control your application flow and interact directly with your data models, helpers, libraries, views, etc. It's pretty much the core the core part of the site. When you go to your website.com slash whatever URL, CodeIgniter will actually take apart your URI and determine which controller needs to be called and then which method inside that controller needs to be called. So if I were to go to SeanMcCool.com and it was a CodeIgniter site, it would send the user to the default controller. Usually it's welcome or main or home, and then the index method inside that controller. The index method would run, and generally you would load the view, which would be your index page, and then output the view, so that you'd have your default splash page or whatever. The email class, it's just a really basic class for dealing with SMTP, or if you need to use a sendmail binary to send your email. It has functionality to easily allow you to send HTML email, MIME attachments, etc. So that's pretty nice. Encrypt allows you to do some basic encryption. Form validation is a pretty robust form validation class, and it's very easy to use and very easy to extend. And built into here you have pagination, a pretty decent sessions class, and a number of other classes. All of this can be found in the CodeIgniter library explained in detail. CodeIgniter can also keep logs of errors, or pretty much whatever you want to log. By default, it doesn't really log anything, so you can use that as your own discretion. Plugins are like helpers, where helpers contain multiple functions that provide a similar family of functionality. A plugin will pretty much contain like one function, and it'll be like a one-off. So sometimes you just need to add like one little thing to your system, and if you want to keep your code modular and reusable, you would probably just make a plugin for it. So you just drop it in there, load the plugin, execute the function. That way, in future projects, you could just copy your plugin over and do the same, and you won't have to worry about copying code or having code intertwined or interdependent. The scaffolding is actually an interesting addition. A number of frameworks have this kind of functionality. What it basically allows you to do is specify a database table, and then it'll provide a very basic CRUD interface where you can add, remove, update data inside that table. So if you don't have an admin interface set up and you're developing and you need to put in some some test data, all you have to do is use scaffolding. You don't have to fire up PHP MyAdmin or Navicat or SQL or whatever application you use to interact with your database. So that's basically everything in the system folder. The application folder is everything that's going to be application specific to your one website. You could run multiple websites off of the same CodeIgniter system, so that when you upgrade CodeIgniter, you are going to upgrade it for all the systems. If you want to add libraries or whatever, you can do that there. The application folder has its own libraries folder, and you can actually just, if you're going to add your own library or write your own library, you would put it here. So usually you don't want to mess with any of the files in the system folder, only inside the application folder, because theoretically you should be able to just cut your application out and like put it into a CodeIgniter 1.7.2 or CodeIgniter 2 or whatever version comes out, and then your application should be ported over. So to start going through the folders here, we have the config folder. Contains auto load, which will allow you to actually auto load libraries so you don't have to load them in your code. Configuration files, helpers, plugins. It's convenient if you're going to use bits of functionality throughout your entire site. For example, you have a configuration file that's specific to the site. Maybe it has an array of options or something, and you want to load it in everywhere. You would just use auto load. Config contains much of the basic configuration for CodeIgniter, including sessions, whether sessions are stored into the database or in temp files, how long the sessions last, whether or not they'll be encrypted, etc. The database configuration file just simply allows you to configure how the database is connected. CodeIgniter doesn't have a really good way to connect to multiple databases and interact between them. So that functionality you might have to put in yourself, but usually you only need to connect to one database, and when you do that with CodeIgniter, it's actually very easy. You can set up multiple database configurations and change the active group, or maybe write some logic that says if the site you're going to is at your dev URL, then pull the development database into the application. Otherwise, use the live site database. Hooks allow you to connect into various parts of the process, the CodeIgniter process, so that you can implement your own custom code. Usually, you rarely actually need to use hooks. There's almost always a better way to do something, but sometimes it comes up. Routes it's a nice bit of functionality. If you want to, for example, if somebody's coming to my website and they're going to website.com/my podcast, and for some reason you want my podcast to actually go to the podcast controller using the method view, then you can just do that, and you can actually basically rewrite the user's experience, the URI strings, to whatever you want to in the application. So sometimes that's really helpful, keeping things well organized and keeping your URI strings looking nice. That's pretty much it for configuration. Controllers is where you're going to put your actual controller file. So here's the default controller. What happens is, if you go to mywebsite.com, it'll go to your default controller. In this case, it's welcome, and then it's going to run the index, just like it would run index.php or index.html. And in this case, it's simply loading the view welcome message. Now, welcome message is a file that contains HTML formatted that says, "Hey, welcome to CodeIgniter," and that's pretty much it. I can change this to anything. I can make my own view. If I make a file called myhtml.php and it's just full of an HTML formatted page, I can just type myhtml, put myhtml.php in the views folder, and it would spit it right out to the site. So I go to mywebsite.com, and there's my html.php's content. Errors contains naturally your error pages. So if you get a 404, it's going to pop up this. You can't connect to the database, it's going to pop up this. So very convenient to keep your website looking nice and consistent. Helpers, like in the system folder, allows you to create your own bits of code that in the application folder is where you would actually create your own helpers. Again, you don't really want to put code in the system folder, because that's going to change. When CodeIgniter gets upgraded, etc., the system folder is going to change, the structure could change, who knows what. But in your application folder, it's all the code that needs to run this site. Hooks is again the same thing as in the system folder. Language, same thing. Library, same thing. Now your models is where you're going to put your data model code. That's going to interact directly with your database. So you might have a user model, and the user model might contain some methods: add user, get users, update user, delete user. So you'll call this code from your controller. So in your controller you might have, okay, there's an add user form. The add user form submits. Your controller takes that information, it does form validation, and if everything validates okay, it's actually going to say, okay, I'm going to call the user model and the add user method. If everything went okay, then give them back a message saying your username has been successfully added, or however you're doing it. But the actual interaction with the database is in the model. You never want to put any kind of interaction with any kind of data source in your controller, in your view. The purpose of an MVC framework in the first place is to keep all that code separate, so that you can easily have different developers working on different aspects. If you have a designer, a database engineer, and just a web developer who are all doing separate tasks. But not only that, it keeps your code much easier to read, much more maintainable, and much more reusable. I might use my user model on every single website that I make, with minor modifications. but it's going to interact with my database tables the same way, because in websites most of the stuff you do is the same stuff but with minor changes. So it really helps. The views folder is where you're going to find all of your views. You can create subfolders. So if I have a controller called dashboard, and inside the dashboard controller is all the functionality you'd provide to a user on their dashboard, you could create a folder under views called dashboard. And you don't have to name it the same as your controller. I do, but it's up to you. And then you can maybe make dashboard index.php. And in here you could write welcome to your dashboard and make it a header, a heading. And if you were going to use a variable, let's go ahead and use this welcome message as an example. Now I'm just going to delete the default welcome message HTML. Say welcome to this site, and I want to put your name. And so the way I do that is I go up to the controller, load up the controller, and I send a parameter. It's actually an associative array. And so I do data username equals Sean, and of course usually you load this in from the database, but we're setting the key username to the value Sean and passing it to the view loader. When we actually pull up the view, we can output that using PHP. And is it name or username? It's username. So this would output welcome to the site Sean. Let's see. That's pretty much it for the basics of the CodeIgniter structure. It's actually a very minimal system, which is one of the things I like the most about it. You can load up the CodeIgniter base class and read over all of the code that actually runs CodeIgniter in about 20 minutes. So it's something I definitely encourage. In future screencasts, I'm going to go over more how to use CodeIgniter to perform different common tasks. So thanks for watching.